everyone, I'm Reagan Kramer, host of Revelations Podcast, where we are devoted to sharing the revelation of Jesus Christ and the freedom that comes from following him through biblical teachings and the redemptive stories of our guests. Follow us on Instagram at therevelations.podcast and subscribe to our website, therevelationspodcast.com, where you can find all of our podcasts on YouTube as well as your favorite platform. As you listen today, may God give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him. Welcome back to Revelations Podcast, and we have a treat for you today. Pastor Doug Van Dorn is with us today. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, you're coming all the way from Colorado, Denver area.
Yeah, out in Denver. I used to live up in Minneapolis, so went to college up in Bethel, and that's where I met my wife. She's from northern Minnesota, so I know all about life up in the tundra.
Yeah, you know about waking up to -2 like I did this morning.
Oh, yeah.
It's fun. Oh, man. Doug is an amazing man of God. He's a pastor, a Christian, husband, father, son, brother, in-law. He's a fifth-generation native Coloradoan. If that, did I say that right? Coloradan?
Coloradan, there you go. There you go.
He's an author. He's got some incredible books, Rings of Revelation, Giants, Sons of God, among others. He's a radio host, CEO, mountain climber, biker, scholar, theologian, thinker, and teacher. He's also a fellow at the Institute for Biblical Anthropology, an entrepreneur, amateur archaeologist, conservative, and lover of all things strange and supernatural. Could be like a conspiracy theorist, but I love how you say on your website, someone who thinks and questions what's going on around them. And like, don't we all want to do that, right? So Doug, I mean, you're just a plethora of information and wisdom. I got to meet you at BlurryCon, and it was an honor. And I'm digging into some of your books, and I've listened to your podcasts. My 12-year-old loves your podcast, Giant Steps. And I just love the way you teach. And so I'm really excited to dig into this conversation.
Yeah, I am too. This is a great topic, and especially for people who haven't, heard a lot about it.
Yeah.
I love introducing people to it.
All right. So we're going to talk about some supernatural stuff today. We're going to talk about the Bible. We're going to talk about mountains and why they're important in the Bible. And there's just a lot of talk about mountains, Doug. I'm doing Isaiah right now for our women's Bible study, and I love the book of Isaiah. It's rich, it's full. But it occurred to me, before I even asked you to come on, I'm reading and I'm going, there's a lot of mountain talk. Why is Jesus, or why is God always talking about, being on a mountain? He's like, it talks about the mountain of the Lord, the holy mountain. The Lord says in Isaiah, on my mountain. And I think of some pretty incredible things in the Bible that have happened on mountains. If we think about the 10 Commandments, the temptation of Christ, the transfiguration, the crucifixion. And so what is God trying to teach us through all this mountain talk?
So you can attack it from the Bible perspective first, or you could attack it from the kind of the religions of the world perspective first. You brought up how lots of things happen on mountains. So it's worth pointing that out and maybe even going a little bit deeper into it, I think. Most people are familiar, the Ark of Noah rests on Mount Ararat, right? Mm-hmm. You think about Abraham being told to go up to Mount Moriah, where he's to sacrifice his son. Think about Mount Sinai, like you've brought up. You think about the Mount Carmel and Elijah and the Baals taking place on the side of that mountain. Jesus' ministry, you find him all over the place. He teaches the Sermon on the Mount on a mountain. He goes up to the Mountain of Transfiguration. He's crucified on a mountain. I would argue that Armageddon is actually a term that means the Mount of Assembly. So it's actually not a plane at all. It's an idea that comes from Isaiah 14. You just brought up Isaiah, the story of kind of Lucifer and the Mount of Assembly. I'm sure we could talk about that verse a little bit, but mountains are all over the place. And the question becomes, why would that be? And that's where you need to understand, first of all, that God is meeting with people on all of these mountains. So it becomes a connecting point between heaven and earth. It's like an axis mundi is the technical word for it. It's a and you think about just the look of a mountain, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because it has its base in the ground, but its top is in the clouds.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was a way, I don't know, I think it's more than just people thought of it that way because it was a nice picture for it. I think there's actually something to this. If you go back and you start looking at mythologies around the world, it doesn't matter where you go. You can be in Greece with Mount Olympus, you can be in China, you can be in North America. All kinds of Indian tribes, local Indian tribes, say that their god lives on top of the mountain. It's like, why would that be the case?
Mm-hmm.
And so now you need to be introduced to something that I just brought up a minute ago, actually, in Isaiah 14, this idea of a mount of assembly. A mount of assembly. What is that? Well, you go to like Psalm 82:1, you'll see that God is taking his place in the divine council. If you read, that's the ESV translation. It's a good translation of it. Divine council is the meeting place of the gods. The gods, if for a Christian, it's hard because we've been taught that the word God means an idol, and so it doesn't have any kind of existence, right? And so it's almost like we blur the first and second commandments into the same thing, but they're different commandments. A God is an entity that's alive, and an idol is the house in which it is kind of caused to reside through an enchantment or a ritual. So they didn't think of idols as living things, but they thought of a living entity, a spiritual entity that would come and reside in it, and then they could like use it for whatever purposes that they would have, and they would obviously give it worship and stuff like that. But if it's easier for people to think about the word angel, I tell them that's fine because they're already comfortable knowing the angels are real, and the Bible uses the term angel and Elohim, especially in the Old Testament, synonymously. So they're really the same idea. They're fallen angels, really. And if I like to tell people to think about their Greek mythology because it's a great analogy for what the Bible itself is doing. If you have these Olympian gods on top of a mountain and they all meet and they deliberate over the affairs of mankind, and then they start interacting with us and stuff like that, that's what you see happening with God on these mountains. He's doing the very same thing. Sometimes, like in Deuteronomy 33, beginning of that chapter, you'll see that God comes to the mountain with a host of angels. Well, it's the same idea. There's an entourage. There's an assembly of heavenly beings that are there present when God is meeting with people, because it's a meeting place between heaven and earth.
That's so cool. And if you think about, Satan's always trying to be like God. So he's going to copycat what God does, right? I mean, God's meeting with people. And then you're saying like these angels that were in heaven that were supposed to look over humanity decided to go their own way, right? And do what they wanted to do. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And then they would meet together, and they would meet together on a mountain, and then they would meet to figure out what they were going to do with us, basically. And so actually Baal in the Old Testament has a mountain, and it's up in Syria. I've just been doing some writing on this the last couple of days, so it's kind of fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
And the biggest mountain that rises out of the Mediterranean. And this was called Baal's Mountain. Mount Zaphon, actually, it's called. And that's the word Zaphon means north. And so this mountain, as Israel's thinking about it, is this evil mountain of the north because this is where Baal resides. Well, they weren't the only people that believed Baal resided there. The Canaanites believed that too, and they worshiped him on that mountain. They built temples. They, did all kinds of things at the base of it and whatever. And so you find this very close to home, not just with our God, but with the gods of the nations. And that Baal Zaphon is actually, again, it's our Isaiah 14 passage. And since I've brought it up all these times, I might as well
that's funny.
Read it because there's a lot going on here. People have heard of this because the famous Latin translation of one of these phrases is Lucifer.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is Isaiah 14:12. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. And that's what the Latin translates as Lucifer. The word in Hebrew is actually Hallel ben Shakar, and it means a shining one.
Yeah.
And Hillel is actually the word that's used in Genesis 3:1 for the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
And Dr. Heiser, Mike Heiser, in his Unseen Realm book, he argues that you can actually translate that word Hillel as either a serpent, as a noun, or as a shining one if you take it as a substantival adjective. So the adjective is actually standing in the place of a noun. And if you did that, you could translate it as the shining one was there in the garden, and then he's the one who comes and talks to Eve. And the question becomes like, what's he doing there? Well, guess what? In Ezekiel 28, Eden is called a mountain. So it's right back to our topic. Let me keep reading in the Isaiah thing. You've been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. And stars is language that's used elsewhere for the gods. They're used in parallel. And then this is the key part. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly in the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. Well, what's that? That's the mountain of Baal. And the Mount of Assembly is the divine council. In other words, this entity wants to rule the council like Zeus. And in fact, I would argue that, and this is a whole other podcast, but I would argue that this entity is Zeus because it's Baal, because it's Baal's mountain, and Baal and Zeus are the same entity. And bringing in the New Testament, we call him Satan. So a little bomb drop for people for like another show. If we
Yeah, my brain's like, what? Okay. Well, and I'm really glad you brought that up. I want to talk about Eden, but I want to just hold that for a minute, because when you're talking about Zeus and Baal and Satan, give us just a really practical, like, how are they the same, and how, when we're looking at all the, ancient history, right, of different cultures, how they looked at it. Because now I think, we read the first two commandments, and we're like, no other gods, no other idols. Wait, what gods? Like, right. And I've tried to explain this to people. It is kind of hard because they were real. And so give us a picture of how they were real.
So the way that I approach this is when you come to something that's really uncomfortable for somebody, you have to start with something that they're not uncomfortable with. And most conservative Christians are not uncomfortable with the idea that Satan is a real entity. That he's like about the only one left that we have like that. But the New Testament is so clear that he's a real person of some kind in the spiritual realm that we're like, okay, I can buy that. Well, if you go to, for example, when Jesus is chastised by the Pharisees for casting out demons by the hand of Beelzebub. Well, Jesus says that Satan can't cast out, or Satan's kingdom can't be divided. So what he's doing there is he's equating Baal with Satan. They're the same entity. Wow. So now all of a sudden you go, well, now wait a minute. You're telling me that all the Baals in the Old Testament that people worshiped as gods are real? I thought they were statues. No, and then that's what I said earlier, is that a statue is a house where a real supernatural entity resides. And this entity is the same creature Jesus says as Satan. And then the Zeus connection is very easy. That this mountain, Mount Zaphon, was actually renamed by the Greeks as Zeus Cassius, because Zeus and Baal are both the lightning storm god of that rules the heavens. They're the same entity. Basically, what happened was the Canaanites were worshiping this deity down in the Mediterranean, and then when the Greeks took over, through Alexander the Great's conquest, they took that god back home because they realized how powerful he was, and they basically elevated him to the top of the pantheon. And then when the Romans took over Greece, they did the same thing, and they just started calling Zeus Jupiter. So they're all the same entity.
But
helpful. They're real.
Right. They're real,
wild, right?
And they're real in a sense of their spiritual entities. You talk about Ephesians 6 and principalities and dominions, and like there are fallen angels over different parts of the world. It's not rocket science to understand when we look at our culture now. Some of these entities are still in power over, different areas of the world, and their strongholds over different places. And anyway, so for people to understand, it's a spiritual that kind of manifests in the physical. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, and again, that's really what the divine counsel on a mountain idea is supposed to get at, because if you think about the base of a mountain being the earth, so that's very concrete, physical, tangible, natural, all that kind of stuff. But the top of it in the clouds becomes ethereal, and it becomes heavenly, and it becomes supernatural. And so this is where there's a link, there's a meeting point between the two places.
Yeah, and isn't that funny how humans, we want to climb all the mountains, right? We want to get as high as we can. You know that. I mean, you live in Denver.
I know it. I've been to the top of all of them in Colorado.
And do you feel closer to the Lord when you're up there?
I do. I actually made it a point to read out loud one chapter of the Bible on the top of every one of them, just so that, and this was before I knew about any of this stuff. So I'm glad I did it. So I know for a fact that scripture has been read on the top of every single 14er in Colorado.
That's amazing. Oh, that brings tears to my eyes. That's beautiful. Wow. Wow. You just blessed all of those, people. That's just amazing. Okay. So, that's a lot. So guys, if you're listening, you might need to just take a deep breath and you write some notes down, listen to this whole thing again if this is the first time you've heard of this. But it really makes the Bible come alive. And when you're reading a lot of the scriptures, things will pop out to you now that the Holy Spirit will reveal, even more of what's going on. So it's exciting. So can we go back to Eden and just,
Sure.
What about that mountain?
Well, so the idea there seems to be that God creates this perfect place that we call a garden, but it's also a mountain. If you think about it, it's the source of all these rivers in Genesis 2. Well, rivers don't come up in the plains of Oklahoma. They come from somewhere higher up, right? A mountain.
Yeah.
And so there's a mountain there, and there's an entity that is allowed to come into the place where God has put his prophet, priest, and king, which is Adam, and then his wife Eve. They've been placed on the mountain. Okay, so it's basically like God is giving them a seat in the council. Mm. And I actually think that this becomes the reason why Satan is so upset, because it's I was created before you. I'm the highest creature, the most beautiful creature, the most powerful that God has ever made. And why isn't he giving me this place that he's just created that's so amazing and beautiful? Why is he giving it to you? You're made of mud. You're a creature of the dust. Who do you think you are? And so he becomes jealous, and he tempts our parents to sin, hoping that maybe he can reverse his fortunes and maybe he can start to rule the earth or whatever. That's a very old idea, actually, that you find with the Jews in the Second Temple literature. So it's not like I made that up.
That's cool.
But that's what he's doing there. And there's a really interesting thing that happens, when she sins, and then it says that he sinned, and then they covered themselves with these fig leaves. Mm-hmm. This is a really strange thing. So I don't deny the physicality of that. I think that that's true, and it plays well into the clothing that happens later in the chapter, where God sacrifices the animal and then clothes them with the animal, because they can't be covered with the sacrifice that they themselves offer. It has to be the bloody sacrifice of the animal that will ultimately atone for their sin. And that's a big foreshadowing of the law in Leviticus, and then all the way to the New Testament, obviously, with Jesus as the lamb. But the fig leaves is strange, man. There's some weird stuff going on there, because there's a couple of places in the Bible that give us reason to believe that the figs from the trees there are actually supernatural entities.
Wow.
Ezekiel 31 is a big, long prophecy against the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, and he starts off the prophecy by likening Pharaoh to Assyria. So in Ezekiel's day, Assyria has just lost its power to Babylon as the world power. And obviously Egypt is nowhere near what it once was when it was power during the days of the Exodus. And it calls Assyria a cedar in Lebanon. And then it starts calling all these other things the trees of Eden. And it's referring to them as gods. And these trees of Eden, these gods, are like going to be punished for what they've done to humanity. And so you read this like Ezekiel chapter 31, and you go, "What in the world is going on?" Well, their punishment is very similar to what happens to Satan. All of the trees of Eden will be brought low, and they will go into Sheol or Hades as punishment for their crimes. So, and there's one other place in Ezekiel, just a couple chapters earlier, the famous chapter where the mountain of God is actually mentioned, Ezekiel 28, and talks about this cherubim in the Garden of Eden, and he's clothed with all these jewels.
Yeah.
And the jewels are very much like the breastplate of what the priest wore. And there's lots of reasons to believe that those jewels are also symbolic, these stones of Eden, of these creatures, these heavenly beings. So in other words, I think what's going on a deeper level than just taking fig leaves and putting them over because they're naked is that they're actually running to the gods, and they're starting to bow down to them because they're terrified of what they've done when they hear God's sound in the garden, right? And so God undoes that very quickly by saying, no, this is not the way it's going to be for you. I'm going to come in. I'm going to be the one who offers the sacrifice. You're going to worship me because I'm your creator and I love you and I'm forgiving you for what you've done. And, the rest of the Bible is just commentary on that.
Okay, Doug, that's a new one for me. I'm trying to wrap my head around that right now. Okay, but it kind of makes sense because it's like that's what we do now, right?
There's nothing new under the sun, right?
Nothing new. Like we run to the gods, we run to the mediums, we run to the fortune tellers, we run to the world and try to get answers and try to be protected in our own comfort and all the things, besides Jesus. And so anyway, I never connected all that, and I don't know, I've never heard anyone talk about it. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, you can find this written about in various places. I'm working on a book right now that is going to talk about it on this Serpent Mound thing that I found in Israel. Yeah. So whenever that finally comes out.
Well, yeah, I'd love to have you back sometime and talk about the Serpent Mount. That is a whole nother podcast, but you've done some amazing work. So thanks for going through that. It says in Ezekiel that the Garden of Eden was also on a mountain, right? Mm-hmm. When we're looking at chronological, and I know we don't know all the answers, there's a difference between Genesis 6, we haven't talked about that yet.
Right.
And what happened there, and then the divine council that was supposed to oversee humanity, right?
Yeah, I think there is. If you go back to Greek mythology, this will help people at least put compartments in it so that they can understand it. I'm not saying that the way that the Greeks tell the story is the right way, but I think that it is the same core story. I was listening to Coast AM one night many years ago, and he had this really interesting guest on named Robert Johnson. And this guy had done a whole bunch of work on the Greek Parthenon. And he basically came to the conclusion that all the panels on the Greek Parthenon telling the Greek stories and myths was basically the Bible reinterpreted so that the good guys are the bad guys and the bad guys are the good guys. And
wow.
I think that that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
The point being that the myths that they're telling, people think of myth as fable, fairy tale, fiction, never happened, totally unreal, ridiculous, tall tales, that kind of stuff. That's not what myth is at all. And nobody ever believed that really until we desupernaturalized the universe a couple hundred years ago. Myths are really just origin stories, and they can be supernatural or not supernatural. They can be true or not true, and you have to kind of weed through them to figure out what's going on. And the way I do it is I hear a story, and then I'm like, I wonder if there's a biblical parallel to that. Sure enough, there often is. And this is one of those cases. So prior to the flood, you had this, and this is in Greek stories, right? Mm-hmm. You had what are called the Titans. These are the parents of the Olympians. Zeus is an Olympian. He's post-flood. His father, Kronos, is a Titan. He's pre-flood. And so, you can go read the stories and how that all happened, but there was basically a giant war that happened. And these Titans were locked up in the deepest parts of hell. And then Zeus and the Olympians came to rule. And they're all kind of genealogically related to each other and stuff like that. Fathers to sons, daughters to sons, fathers and stuff like that. But there's a flood that takes place in between um, with the Greeks, but especially with the Bible, so that you have a group of these entities pre-flood. That's the Genesis 6 stuff. And are they ruling in a divine council prior to the flood over mankind? We don't really know, actually. The Bible is pretty silent on that. We do know that they were doing some crazy things down here, and we know that people were worshiping them, and then it got so bad God decided to destroy the whole earth.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the divine council goes in the Bible, we're really talking post-flood guys like the Olympians, like Zeus, like I said, is Satan. So this is found all over the place. People just don't really know what they're looking at when they see it. But anytime you see any kind of a heavenly story and there's entities that are around, it's a divine council story. Pretty basic. You think about like a Daniel 4, where it says that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream where he's a giant tree and he's going to be lopped off and, brought low. Well, it says the watchers came down.
Yeah.
And by the decree of the watchers, he's going to be brought low. And you're like, what am I reading here? Well, the watchers is a term for these entities. They're also called the sons of God in some places, or they're called angels in some places, or they're called stars, all kinds of terms for them. Mm-hmm. But they're ruling. Like, how does a watcher make a decree if it's not a real thing and it's not in a council, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
I remember
it's found all over the place. So,
yeah, I remember the first time I realized that. I was like, oh, that's mind blowing. But it's like God has other entities that he's given some permission to watch over us. And he's
just like us. I mean, he gave human beings permission to rule the earth. And so God's the king. He's the high king. He has all authority in heaven and earth. But for whatever reason, he has lesser human beings rule for him and carry out dominion because he wants to do that.
Right. And and then when we keep going in Genesis, like he gave us dominion and he wanted us to be fruitful and multiply, right? But we sinned. So are you saying, I just want to go back to the garden one more time, that there were those entities that could have been those fig leaves that were part of the divine council in the garden?
Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's a possibility. And then, what did they do until the flood?
Well, I mean, I do think that the divine council idea is there in Genesis 3. After that, between Cain and Abel and then the flood, we don't have a lot of information, but you can extrapolate, right? And you can go, okay, if they were there beforehand and then people started worshiping them, which they did, then you can probably assume that they had some sort of a council, just like the Greek stories tell you that Kronos did.
Okay.
And so whatever's happening, they're deliberating over the affairs of mankind. They decide at some point to come down on a mountain. This is according to Jewish and Babylonian tradition, believe it or not. It's not just the Jews that tell this story. In fact, Canaanites tell the same story as well in their own ways. But they all tell that they came down on one mountain, which is interesting. Like if you're in Babylon, hundreds of miles away to the east across a desert, why wouldn't you place the location of this in your own country? But they don't. They place it on a mountain in Israel called Mount Hermon, which is the tallest mountain in Israel. And they say that basically these pre-flood fallen angels came down, saw our women, took them, and then they had these children called these Nephilim, that are the giants. Yeah. And this becomes one of the reasons why humanity was so corrupted. In fact, all flesh was corrupted, which is an interesting language, because what does that mean? Is it just what does it mean for the flesh to be corrupted? Like all the cows just started going crazy or something? Or maybe is it biological? Could it be there's something like that going on? Mm-hmm. I tend to think probably that was the better answer. So God destroys the world, and then those guys are locked up, as 2 Peter and Jude both tell us.
Yeah. So I'm just envisioning, this divine council on this mountain, wherever they were, the second heavens, whatever you want to say. And then because the book of Enoch references like 200 fell. So just like 200 decided, because they made a pact, to come down and procreate with the daughters of man. But were the other ones still just hanging out?
Probably. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's the idea. 200, if you think about the host of heaven being myriads and myriads, like Revelation 10,000 times 10,000, it's not a lot. It's not a big number, right? But it's a significant enough number to cause a lot of damage down here.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating. So that's Genesis 6. And then what do you think, once the flood happened and all of these divine counsel, that fell and, caused all this evil with humankind and maybe animals. And like you said, there was a whole bunch of crazy things going on. After the flood, what happened to their spirits?
So Peter says that they're locked up in the gloomy chains of darkness in Tartarus. Peter and Jude both say that. So that's 2 Peter 2:4, and then Jude 6 say that. And they're referencing this it's basically, Reagan, it's a universal view at the time of the New Testament. In my circles, I come across people saying that that's not what they're talking about all the time. And they would never talk about something like that because it never happened. Well, we know, I mean, I've done a lot of research on this. We have over 50 different examples of Jews before the time of Christ up through the 1st century, and of Christians up until the middle of the 3rd century, and really all the way to the beginning of the 5th century, except for one guy who all believe this story, and we have no exceptions in the other direction. So that's 50 resources and none in the other direction that are all agreeing with what I'm saying is the interpretation of Jude and 2 Peter. They're all referencing this universal story that's not just told by the Jews, it's told by everyone around the world.
Yeah, even Josephus.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The historian, who wasn't even a Christian that we know of at the time, but
exactly.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Oh, and then the offspring of, that procreation of the Nephilim in the humans. What happened to them after the flood? The spirits.
Well, so the ones at the flood were destroyed, I think. I mean, that's my opinion, is that that was the reason for it. Now, some people will say, well, some of them hid out in caves and lived through it or something like that. Lived through the flood. I think that kind of defeats the point of what the flood was for and what Genesis tells us. So my view is that there were Nephilim after the flood. Genesis 6 tells you that, and so does Numbers 13. So it's like, well, how did they get there? And I think that what happened was basically the Olympians, if you want to call them that, came down and did the same thing that was happening with the Titans after the flood. And my guess is what they did is they said to themselves, well, hey, God sent this flood and he swore to Noah he would never flood the earth again. So we're good to go.
Wow. Do you think that has to do with Babel?
I do. Yeah. In part, at least. Yeah. So Babel, we start off talking about mountains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Babel is basically the anti-mountain, because it's not a mountain that God made. It's a mountain that men make. That's its function. It's a ziggurat. It's a staircased ziggurat pyramid-like structure that we find these all over the earth too. And their purpose was to meet with the gods on the top of the mountain, in a very similar way, I think, to what you find with idolatry, where you do some sort of a ritual incantation, you cause them to come down, and then you interact with them, and whatever else happens. And I really very strongly believe that that's exactly what was going on at Babel. It's like they want to reach out to these entities again because all this time has gone by. They're in utter darkness. They don't have the light. They've been given over to sin already. You don't have to go far after the Noah story to find that. Noah himself and then his son Canaan, right? It's like sin it's omnipresent. And so this is what human beings do. Like you said, when we were talking about this in the Garden of Eden, it's like our default. We're going to go to anybody but the true Lord.
Yeah. And he's so merciful and kind, because through all of this biblical narrative, he's always got a plan. He's always waiting for us, to come to him. He has mercy and grace over us. And that's why, Christ's life, death, and resurrection, this even for me, when I started to learn all of this, made what he did for me even more powerful. I mean, like someone dying for your sins is like the ultimate gift. But then you look at what was possibly going on, like in real time, right? Of like, okay, God is just waiting to meet with his people, yet they're always looking to meet with a false God, or with not a false God, but a God that isn't the one true God.
Yeah.
And our hearts,
they're false in that they're false in that they're liars, not they're false and as in they don't exist.
That's a great distinction. Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because I use false gods a lot. And it's like, if you don't describe that, it gets confusing to people.
Yeah.
But then to just, have him have this plan to send his one and only son into the world to die for us so we can be part of his family. And like you said, his divine counsel, because that picture of Satan being jealous of us is just wild, right? I mean, because we think, Lucifer had basically everything he could ever want and had all this dominion, and God used him, wanted to use him to be a mighty, entity for him. And he became prideful and fell. And what a picture of us. But yet, the fallen angels can't be redeemed, but humankind can, correct?
Right. Yeah, Jesus' blood he was a human being for a reason. He did not sacrifice himself as an angel.
Yeah. So good. So can you dig into a little bit, just Moses and the 10 Commandments and what happened on that mountain and kind of how it relates to what we're talking about?
Okay, so the epicenter of the Moses 10 Commandments thing is obviously the law. So God is coming down with an intercessor on the top of a mountain, and he's giving Moses the law to then go down and disseminate to the people. Mm-hmm. This is actually the same thing that you find in the Garden of Eden, believe it or not. It's just we think of it in a different way. So think about God gave Adam and Eve the command not to eat from the tree. So that's the law. Where is it? Well, it's in the center of the garden. And then you have the garden outside of that, and then you have the world outside of that. If you look at Mount Sinai, it's the same thing. It's just you have to view it from a vertical perspective, like a satellite looking straight down on the mountain. So when you're on the top of a mountain, you're in the center of the mountain from that perspective. You're not on the top, you're in the center, like a target. Right. And then in the middle of the mountain, you have the mountain, and then you have the bottom where all the people are. And this is actually exactly what you find in all the temples of the scripture, because Sinai becomes a temple, Eden becomes a temple. And this is pictured for you in the tabernacle. That's the best place you can see it. So the tabernacle has the courtyard where people could go to offer sacrifices for their sin. But then it has the holy place, and only the priests can go into the holy place. And then it has the most holy place, and only one guy, the high priest, can go into that. That's the same as Moses. He's the only one allowed to the top of the mountain. And what's in the most holy place? Well, the tablets of the covenant, the law, because it's just like Eden. It's the central place where God is revealing his righteousness and where he's taking his seat. So the throne on the ark is technically the seat of God. So this is why he's on the top of the mountain. It's the place of the council. It's where he has a seat. It's why you find God in the middle of the Garden of Eden, because that's kind of his home. And so what's happening is that you have the law coming from the divine realm that's being disseminated to humanity through this cosmic mountain. And same thing as what all the ancient pagans believe. If you go read the law code of Hammurabi, you'll see that Hammurabi says that he got his law from his God. His God gave it to him. And so then you start reading the law of Moses, and you start going, well, now wait a minute. God says my law is not like anybody else's law, because mine is actually righteous through and through, and just and holy. And so you're going to be a people to me that's peculiar. You're going to be a holy nation, a whole nation of royal priests, all this kind of stuff. And that is what makes Israel what Israel is supposed to become. And what, of course, they always fail at doing, but what ultimately true Israel, which is who Jesus is, he is everything Israel is supposed to be, embodied in perfection, who obeys the law perfectly so that we can have his righteousness credited to us by faith.
Beautiful. So they get the law. Well, Moses gets, I mean, you know the story. But then he goes down the mountain and sees all the people in sin, you know, and the golden calf situation. And
Isn't
then,
that interesting? So first of all, you have sin at the bottom of the mountain. Like we can't even go that long. He's still at the top of the mountain receiving the law, and they're sinning. And then you have the golden calf. And if you read the golden calf story, it's really interesting because Aaron says, let's have a feast to Yahweh. So what they're not doing is at that point worshiping false gods or lying gods, fallen angels. They're actually worshiping the true God, but they're doing it in a way he has forbidden, which is through idolatry. Idolatry is we're going to make that God that's up there come and be in this calf so that we can somehow manipulate him and cause, because that's too terrifying for us up there. They say at the end of the 10 Commandments, it says the God came and all the people wanted to die. Right. And most, it's like they can't handle that. So we got to make this a little bit more cozy and comfy for us, because whatever that is up there, it's terrifying.
Well, it's his holiness, right?
Exactly.
And now, the curtain is torn. The Holy of Holies is torn because of Christ. So we can come directly to him and be in his presence and pray with him. And, Ephesians says that we can be in the throne room with him, and every spiritual blessing we can have through faith in his son. And so this is good. This is wild stuff, Doug.
I know. And it just, it goes on and on. It's really, once you kind of dip your feet in, you realize at some point when you start looking down into the water that I can't see the bottom of this. We're not dipping our feet in a kiddie pool. This is deep waters, but it's so interesting and so exciting. And it brings the story of the Bible to life in a way that I tell people, it's like it's not changing anything that I've ever believed. What it's doing is it's adding to it. So it's kind of like I've watched black and white television. I've been watching the first season of Gilligan's Island in black and white. And then the next year it comes out and it's in color. That shows how old I am. And no, I was not alive for when that came out. I only knew that because of reruns.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. Yeah, that's funny. We were watching a movie last night in black and white, and my husband's like, could we see if there's a color version? Because it was so old.
Right.
And it changes everything. I mean, everything just pops and comes alive, and it makes it more interesting. So in that, I thought about that too, because I've been to Haiti multiple times, and they always talk about how they go and pray, like the pagan people and the voodoo people, like they go pray in the high places, right? And that they're still sacrificing, and there is all over the world, whether we want to admit it or not, sadly. But it's interesting that they want to go meet the evil entities in the high places and sacrifice, and they think that there's power in that, even in people around the world today. Yeah.
Here's something to kind of connect that to what we said before. Remember, I said that the trees of Eden and the stones of fire. So I'm going to have a whole chapter on this in this upcoming book on trees and stones. Well, what do you find on high places? First of all, it's a mountain. It's a tiny one, but it's still a mountain. It's a high place. So even if it's only a 5-foot tall thing that you've erected and put a bunch of dirt on top of, it's a mountain. It's a cosmic mountain. That's its purpose. It's to be an axis mundi. It's to be a meeting place. And what do they put on top of it? Well, one of two things: trees or stones. That's it. And why? Well, because somehow these two things are connected with the idea of these fallen entities. And I mean, the whole world knows about this. This is what the megaliths are all about, I think. The pagan megaliths, whether it's Stonehenge or Gilgal Rephaim by the Serpent Mountain, it doesn't matter what it is. Those are the stone things. And then obviously like the Asherah poles in the Old Testament. Or honestly, even the crucifixion of Jesus, because what is that? That's a tree. And so Jesus becomes the perfect fulfillment, the only way that we can have a mediator that will tell us the truth about what the divine realm is actually like. And he ends up dying on that hill, becomes a curse for us.
Wow. The symbolism in that.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
profound.
It's very profound.
Wow. Thank you for that. I love you mentioned this in the beginning, but I love how you said in the biblical worldview, God comes down to us. In a pagan worldview, we go to the gods to get them to do what we want them to do. And so I have one more question for you, but just to bring this full circle, I mean, if we can think of that in our own lives and apply it that way, you know, God comes down to us because he loves us so much, and he's just waiting, you know, for this relationship with us and just this intimacy as a child of God that he died for. But yet, you know, if we just think about in our own lives what we want answers for and how we want things in our life to go the way that we want them to do, and what worldly and pagan things do we look to. And I'm saying that as like talking to myself, and but also just to bring some clarity into this. If we think everything's like, this is kind of crazy and it's supernatural, well, so is Christ's life, death, and resurrection.
You know, for whatever reason, as you were talking, what popped into my mind was Jesus telling us not to worry. Like, I don't know why that popped in my mind, but it does, because what is us worrying a result of? It's because I can't control my circumstances. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here in terms of man wanting to reach up to God, us trying to be the ones who are playing God, controlling the things in our lives. And when Jesus tells you not to worry, what he's essentially saying is that, look, God has come down in the form of me, in the form of my spirit at Pentecost when he descends upon his people. And I've got the whole thing under control. So don't worry. It's, you know, it's kind of like the testing of Israel in the wilderness. I'm going to bring you out into this place. There's not going to be any food or water, but I'll take care of you. And so what do? They complain and they grumble and they gripe and they moan and they want to go back to Egypt and the gods of Egypt that God has just defeated. And, you know, all the funny stories that take place in the Exodus of God getting mad. So he gives them meat for a month and it comes out their nostrils. And, and you know, it's so interesting to think about what God provides for us. And I think that this is a practical implication of understanding the supernatural worldview, that worry is actually something that has its roots in something that is supernaturally evil.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And we don't think of it that way. You know,
no,
we think we're doing something when we're worrying, Doug. It feels good. Okay. We touched on this, but in the New Testament, how do we see Jesus reversing the evil and destruction that the enemy has caused through all of those things? I mean, we've talked about the crucifixion, but the transfigurations, Caesarea Philippi, there's just some really cool things that he did for us.
Yeah, I think you're kind of referencing the talk that I gave at BlurryCon, right?
Yes, I think I am.
Yeah, I don't think they recorded that either. So, like, here's just a very quick overview of that. But
it's awesome.
Effectively, Jesus's ministry is a multiple phased attack on Satan. And you have to understand kind of some cosmic geography, and some of the motifs we've been talking about here are also very helpful. So that there's a little bit of background people have with that. But the main cosmic geography stuff is that the area of Galilee and north of it all the way up to Mount Hermon was viewed as the land of the serpent. In fact, that's what Bashan means, is the land of the serpent. And that's because of these watchers are described as serpentine in appearance, and because Satan is a serpent and stuff like that. And so Jesus has all this stuff going on in Bashan, and the Galilee, and especially in Luke's gospel. In Luke, he's only up in the Galilee until he makes his way for the final time to Jerusalem. That's it. So when he goes out to be tempted, my opinion is that he's being tempted in the Bashan. He's not going way down south to the Judean desert. That makes absolutely no sense of anything. He's in the wilderness where he's already at. He goes up into there and he's tempted by the devil. He's taken to a high mountain. What's that high mountain? It's almost certainly Mount Hermon, the very place where the watchers descended, the place where Satan says, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. And Jesus starts reciting one of the most supernatural Psalms in the Bible, Psalm 91, back to him after Satan quotes it to him. It's like super weird. If anybody wants to read my translation of that, it's the very last thing in my book on giants.
Good, I got it.
So wild of stuff. So Jesus is overcoming the devil at that point. He goes and he's healing all these people in his ministry, casting out demons. Well, that land is full of demons. A whole other thing we haven't talked about, don't have time here, but the whole idea of giants and what happened when a giant died is that its spirit became the evil spirits of the New Testament. And so Jesus is attacking these, basically the offspring of the watchers that we read about in Genesis 6, when he's casting out demons. When he goes up to the Transfiguration, he goes up to Caesarea Philippi, which is at the base of Mount Hermon. He goes to right in front of the cave of Pan, which they've been worshiping this entity, evil entity, for millennia, even before he got there. And he talks about how the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. And the cave of Pan was actually called the gates of hell because it was this bottomless pit that they tried to fathom with a rope, and they could never get to the bottom of it. And so they believed that it was an entrance into Hades.
Wow.
And so Jesus says, right here, I'm going to start right here, gates of hell won't prevail with it. So then he goes right up to a high mountain, which I do not believe is Mount Tabor, which is 70 miles away. Why wouldn't he go up to the highest mountain, which is literally right there? Which is much more meaning and significance, which is a fulfillment of Psalm 89, by the way. And he transfigures himself in Psalm 89, and the moon and the stars are watching this. They're bearing witness. Well, that's language in the Bible of heavenly entities. So it's not just Moses and Elijah there, and it's not just the three apostles. It's also these other entities. And Mount Hermon actually happens to be the mountain of El, the Canaanite god, who's the equivalent of Kronos. And most certainly, Satan is also there, because when Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, I believe that he's actually invoking the language of the storm god, of Satan there. And where would he have fallen? I think he fell on Mount Hermon, because this was kind of like a declaration and a casting out of Satan so that he would go and do what he was going to do. And what was he going to do? He was going to go try and put this Messiah guy to death to stop the whole thing. So then he does that, goes and kills Jesus on a tree on Calvary on a cosmic mountain. Well, we've already talked about all that, the significance of that, and the sacrifice that atones for our sin. And then Jesus descends into hell, where he, in Psalm 24, storms the gates of hell and demands entrance so that he can, in Psalm 68, release the captives, which are all the believers from the Old Testament. Everybody went to Hades. Hades is a huge land. It's not just a tiny place of only burning. It was a land. It was like a country. And the believers in the Lord went to Abraham's bosom, as the story of Lazarus, the rich man, tell us. And Jesus emptied it, brought him to heaven to be with himself, because now their sins had been paid for by his blood. So they were free. And then he rises from the dead, and he proclaims his victory everywhere he's going after that. And then he ascends to heaven over the right hands, to the right hand of power, over all powers and authorities in heaven and on earth. So like his entire ministry is this wild supernatural ride, if you know what you're looking at, and you know that he's doing. And it's just there's so much more there, but that's kind of a summary of it.
Amazing. Wow. Thank you, Doug. That's amazing. I would love for you to come back sometime and just talk about giants.
I like to talk about giants.
That'd be easy for you. No. Are you still pastoring in Colorado?
Yeah, we're coming up on 23 years here at this church that we planted back in 2001. In fact, I guess it would probably be 23 years now.
Awesome.
Because we planted at the end of 2001, right after the towers fell.
Wow.
Been going ever since.
That's amazing. Well, God bless you in your ministry. Do you share some of this stuff from the
Oh
pulpit?
yeah, I've taught this to everybody in the church. I started learning about it probably 2008,
Okay.
I would guess.
Wow.
And it took me a couple years before I said anything to anybody because I had to figure out if I thought it was right, and I thought that this is something that would be helpful. I knew right
Yeah.
away that it would be helpful. And then I needed to figure out how I could teach this to people and not like have rocks thrown at me and be stoned to death. And I think I figured out a way to do it right away. It wasn't that hard. You just start with the Bible and you show people what they already believe, but they don't know it.
Hmm.
For example, here's a funny story. A friend of mine had a Bible study over at his house, and we started talking about giants. This was in the very early days, and he just got frustrated, and he finally just he used to fall asleep literally in our Bible study at his house when I would talk about them.
That
Like I
might have
think
been
this
a
was a
demonic
supernatural attack,
manifestation.
100%. And so he finally one day just when I said, "Why do you keep talking about this? It's so ridiculous. There's no such thing as giants." And I said, "Man, have you not heard of Goliath? Do you not believe in him?" He goes, "Yeah, but he's just a tall guy." I said, "Have you ever looked at his genealogy?" He goes, "Well, no." I said, "Well, why don't we look at his genealogy?" Showed him that he comes from the Rephaim.
Yeah.
He goes, "Well, what are those?" And I said, "Well, I've been trying to tell you, they're giants. They go all the way back to Genesis 14. And from there, it was like automatic because what happened was, and this is actually what I think is going on at the heart of why people don't accept this. There is a moral problem, not an intellectual problem that people have with this. And I don't know what it is exactly, Reagan, but there's something that makes people angry about this. And when they can recognize that they already believe what I'm telling them, they just don't realize it. And so you use like Satan is real,
Yeah.
but he is Zeus, that kind of a thing. Or Goliath, you believe in him, so why don't you believe Og was 13 feet tall or whatever?
Right.
It's the same Bible. It's the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
So where's the problem? You already believe that God has you believe that Daniel 4 is true and that there's watchers and that there's decrement they're making, but you just haven't thought about what that means,
Mm-hmm.
And I think once you get an inroad in somebody's mind and that little worm gets in there and they're like, yeah, I guess I do already believe it. It's kind of like if they're a believer, then at some point in time, it's just going to click.
Yeah. And I think people are sometimes worried about what other people are going to think about them. Like if they believe this stuff and I don't know. I think we make it about us way too much, and it's like, let's just read the Bible and see what it says and what God wants to teach us. And that's why I love your teaching, because you're so wise and spiritually attuned, but yet you're just really chill about it and you just teach it. And so I think people can grasp it a little bit more and you make it normal. And I really appreciate that because that, this stuff is, Dr. Laura Sanger, when I started listening to her stuff like 3 years ago, I was like, wait, this is a lot. Do I want to go here? Can I do this? And the Lord, I couldn't get away from it. Then I would read the scriptures and he would just reveal something to me. And I'm like, oh man, okay. And now it's not scary. It is, you guys, once you start to understand this, you're actually going to have more peace because you're going to understand what actually happened and how much God loves you and how much, he is protecting us and is there for us and has done all of this to defeat the evil forces of darkness. So it's amazing.
I when I wrote the giant book, I made a very deliberate attempt the first time around to make sure that I ended it on the first coming, because in that instance, and it's only borne fruit in the last 10 years, 11 years since that came out, that everybody wants to jump to the second coming. And I'm like, no, you guys, you're missing the point.
Yeah, exactly.
This is about what Jesus has already done. Yes. This is supposed to be giving you peace and hope and comfort in the world right now. It's not supposed to be making your mind race to know if Nephilim are coming back in the future.
Yes.
And so tell the story of how this really focuses on the first coming. And man, that just makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah. And God's not worried. He knows when he's coming back.
Exactly.
I don't worry about that. But then, because if you worry about that, you lose what he has for you right now. So,
yeah.
So, okay, this was awesome. Doug, if people want to go to your website, follow you on social, what do they do?
Well, as of right now, as of right this moment, you can go to douglasvandorn.com. That's kind of my main website. All my books are at Amazon. That you can access them through my website or go to Amazon. I don't make any money from them on my website, so that doesn't really matter. I'm on basically Facebook, and then my kids keep trying to get me on Instagram, but I have plans in the fairly near future to start some stuff for people, at least in my community in the Reformed world, where we can start accessing one another. So at some point in time, that might come to fruition, but that doesn't exist yet. So,
and then your podcast is Giant Steps.
I do too many podcasts. I do my podcast is Giant Steps. That's just me, and Rudy produces it. Mm-hmm. That's on YouTube and every other place you can find. These are all my podcasts are on my website, including this one. I'll link it there too. But
awesome.
I also do one with Brian Godawa and Derek Gilbert and Judd Burton called Iron and Myth. And we've got, I'm close to 40 episodes that we've done with that. And I'm doing another one called Kingdoms Unveiled that we might be changing the name of that with John Moffat. And we've got, I don't know, 50 of those probably out now.
Wow.
So, yeah, I try to keep I just want people to know the information. I don't care about anything else. And this is a great way to do it. It's a modern way of communicating with people. And if others want to listen to it, then I'm happy to do it.
Love it. Well, I'll link all of those in the show notes so you guys can buy the books, keep up with Doug Van Dorn. And Doug, we would be honored if you would just close us in prayer, for those who are listening and, are just starting to dig in, some of those that are have been in this and they're just excited about it, that God would continue to open the eyes of their heart.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to.
Thanks.
Well, Lord, it's been fun to be on this show and to talk about what I think are really important things and things that the world is missing, especially the Christian church. And we've been missing it for a long time. It's not like it's new, and it's all over your word. And many Christians throughout the centuries have believed in these things, but we've just kind of lost them. And I know that can be a hard thing for people when they are first hearing it, to kind of think that this is novel or heretical, or, all kinds of things come up in our minds. I pray that you would drive people to the scripture, and that you would help them to dig in and consider what your word says about the supernatural realm, because it's the very place where you're at. It's where Jesus ascended into heaven, and he's at right now at the right hand of the Father. And there's all kinds of other entities out there that you've created that your word talks about, that we know a little bit about. In some cases, we know more about it. It's so practical to know about these things, and I pray that you would help people to see them. And those who are excited about it, I would ask that you would keep them level-headed and keep them focused on what Jesus has already done, even though the temptation can be to go into weird speculative things in the future, and that's fine to do. But Lord, the most important thing is that your Son, for his work already for us in suffering and dying, that he's glorified above all things. And that's my main purpose in talking about it. I know it's Reagan's heart as well, and I would ask that you would do this for your people in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for listening to Revelations Podcast. I am honored and humbled that you are here. If you would like to partner with us and contribute financially to editing and production costs, would you go to www.therevelationspodcast.com and hit the contribute button. Otherwise, go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a 5-star rating. It lends credibility to the show, and it helps spread the word about what God is doing. Thank you so much for supporting the Revelations Podcast.